Ben, I'd like to begin with you this morning and talk a little bit about the roots of some of the actions of Iran. And we know that Iran is a state sponsor of terrorism. We know the work that it's done to sponsor anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial and distortion. As someone who's watched this for years, can you tell us what is actually at the root of all of this?
Sure. Well, thank you very much for that very kind introduction. It's a pleasure to share the stage with both of you and to ADL for organizing what I think is a very timely and important panel. Listen, the same thing that is true in Washington is true in Tehran, which is that personnel is policy. If you want to understand the rogue regime of the Islamic Republic today, you need to quite literally understand the men that founded, created, and have been at the helm of the government of the Islamic Republic for the past 43 years. And in this instance, the quite literal founding father of the Islamic Republic, if I may borrow a phrase, Ayatollah Khomeini, cut his teeth on the issues that we have now known the Islamic Republic to be leading in, which is anti-Westernism, anti-Americanism, anti-Israeli, anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, quite literally talking about these things in speeches pre-exile, post-exile, and then when he was back at the helm in 1979, 1980, helped to fashion a form of government where state power, state resources could be put behind those ideologies. So when we talk about hate speech, and some of you have been listening to some of the comments on the cyber and the tech space today, and you'll talk about how this may move into the media space and elsewhere tomorrow, the challenge of the Islamic Republic is that it is using state resources, a government's apparatus to push those ideologies forward. And we all know what those ideologies are, but it is quite dangerous when a government like this puts its money where its mouth is. And you see the price of that across the battlefields of the Middle East, within Israel today, and most recently, I should say, the people of Ukraine, where the Islamic Republic is helping to underwrite Putin's war of imperial aggression there. There's an old saying about the Islamic Republic, which is that the Iranian people are the longest suffering victims there. They're the longest suffering victims of that oppression, but that oppression has been exported because of this government's desire to make its fight global.
Can I ask you a follow-up on that? So when you're talking about the kind of money that's going into this effort, what are we talking about here? What percentage of the money that they have is going towards an external policy?
Well, I need not give you a line item, but I can tell you something even better, qualitative rather than quantitative. There is a reason that, for instance, since 2009, you've had street protests in Iran that chant, Na Ghaze, na Lebanon, janam fadai Iran, which is not Gaza, not Lebanon, my life for Iran. Or protests since 2017, 2018, where you have protesters talking about Iran's bailing out of the Assad regime, saying, Suriya ro raha kon, fikri bima kon. Or, forget Syria, think about us, is what it translates to, which is that the Iranian people are tired of the government of the Islamic Republic consistently choosing bombs over butter, and it's why you have that state-society chasm that has resulted in so many boom and bust cycles of protests that we see today. So it's not just about the number, it's that the number is being felt.
That's a very important point. And Marjan, I'm going to turn to you to talk a little bit about the context here. You've been watching for the last 44 years, the changes that have been taking place in Iran since the revolution. What's so different about what happened last year and what's continuing to happen? And how do you see the role of the diaspora playing into this as well?
Of course. Let me just begin by sharing what Iran is really experiencing today. Today is May 1st. It's an international day for workers and laborers. And as we speak, there are dozens and perhaps hundreds of protests taking place across the country and counting. Yes, on the one hand, we are not hearing about the magnitude of protests the same way that we heard in September in the aftermath of the murder of Mahsa Amini and in the subsequent months. But I can tell you that the protest movement has continued in Iran, but it has taken different shapes and different forms. Iranians are very innovative people, and they have found various ways to engage in acts of civil disobedience. Strikes of laborers and economic withholdings of the businesses is the way that we are going to see increasingly, and it's one of the best ways actually that the total of the society, not just the women who are risking their lives and getting blinded and shot in the eye and shot in the body, should not be taking all the burden of the protest, but there are methods of civil disobedience such as protests, strikes, and economic pressures on the government, not paying the bills perhaps, are other ways that are being explored. But also, there is a reality inside Iran. If I had to use one word to describe today's state of the Islamic Republic, I would call it a bankrupt state. It is a state that is bankrupt because it has no legitimacy within its own people. They're no longer recognized as a representative government. In terms of resources, there is 60% level of poverty in the country. People are hungry and they're suffering and they're not going to stay quiet. In terms of intellectual capacity of the country, at least 30% of those with college education are likely to leave the country because the environment is not hospitable for their interests, because of the variety of persecutions, and also because there is really no opportunity for them to stay there. And then in terms of the environment, finally, the country literally is about to sink. The ground beneath the Iranian people's feet is literally about to sink. There was a recent confidential document that was hacked and shared with the international community. Right now it's making its rounds with the Persian language media. And what it shows is that because of the mismanagement of the environment and the unnecessary management of the water and abuse of the water resources in the country, the state of the earth has deteriorated to such an extent that in at least 360 cities, there is a possibility of the ground literally collapsing beneath them. And this is a reality that Iranians are waking up to. They're hungry, they're poor, there's no hope for them, and now they have to deal with this catastrophic environmental challenges. So the situation is not good, but because of the situation is not good, and the facade of the reformists, conservatives, traditionalists, the purples and the blues, and all the marketing ploys that they had to present themselves as the fixers of the revolution, all of that is gone, and Iranians have reached a point of no return, and we have to acknowledge it for what that is.
So that's really interesting. So as you're watching this protest, it's not the first time we've seen protests in Iran, but what you're saying is this time is different, and do you think it has sticking power?
It has sticking power, but it has to be echoed on the outside. We cannot expect the protest movement to remain in the original form of people in the streets, although there's actually a report by FDD recently that demonstrates that the protest movement is picking up again. Nonetheless, as a human rights activist, as someone who knows the risk that it's really put upon the Iranians when they go out in the streets and they're risking getting literally shot and blinded, arrested, raped, etc., I think that we need to shift the focus and acknowledge that acts of civil disobedience will be good enough, will be acts of protest. And every time that a woman walks around the streets of Iran without her hijab, she is protesting at great risks to herself. And it is not because Iran has suddenly become a free country. No, all of the threats are still there, but the bravery is still commendable.
I think this is a really important point that you're making, and one that we're beginning to see translated into the way things are being reported about Iran. But there is a question in my mind, and I'm going to ask you one last follow-up. Is the American press looking at this the way they need to be? Because the way you're describing it is far more acute than the way you're hearing people write about the protests.
So the American media really was asleep for 44 years and did not really look at the atrocities that were taking place in Iran, in the streets, in Iranian prisons. Just the fact that suddenly overnight, Iranian women lost their rights and became worth half of the, as much as a man. And they were just able to, and all the feminist movement, they were able to ignore that atrocity and acknowledge it as I guess, a cultural footprint that they did not, the footnote that they did not really care about. But I'm grateful that since the murder of Mahsa Amini, there is more attention to Iran, there are more attention to human rights issues, but it's really not enough. And the media needs to learn to be adaptable and continue to focus on what the activists are doing and how the movement is taking shape. One example is that we hear about the poisoning of the schoolgirls across the country. This started to happen about a year ago, and again, the media was asleep and they were not paying attention to it. This behavior is exactly what the Taliban did to dissuade the girls from participating from getting an education. But now they are doing this because the protest movement was so robust and so jaw-dropping among the schoolgirls who would lift up their hijabs, who would show the middle finger to the picture of Khomeini and Khamenei and Raisi in the classrooms and take selfies of themselves bravely. They were doing that, and because they have done that, they are trying to threaten the girls and the families and teach them a lesson so that they would not participate in any of such acts. Because the price is so high, the media needs to focus on the shifting of the revolution. They need to shift on their attention and talk about the strikes that are taking place in the tire industry, in the sugar companies, in the petrochemical industries. These are all engines of the revolution. These are all engines of the protest. And just to end, as much as the media has to do their job, I think we as an audience, we also have to do our jobs. When we see stories coming out of Iran, we should click, because those clicks matter. They tell the editors that actually there is an audience, there is an appetite for this. So we cannot ignore this. We cannot just let this happen and sit idly by. We need to pay attention and interact with it.
Thank you for that. Ben, one of the things that you and I were talking about in the green room is the grand shift of strategy that Iran has demonstrated in terms of geopolitics. I'd love for you, Marjan just talked about what we ought to be paying attention to from the perspective of the people that are protesting. Now put yourself in a policy position. Tell us what is taking place with regard to this new way of being Iran. Suddenly Iran is reaching out to their adversaries, both the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates. This is not the old playbook, this is a new playbook. Why are they doing this? Why is it significant? And why should Americans care?
Well, we could actually go on for hours just about this one point, but it is actually, in my view, somewhat consistent with the larger arc of the Islamic Republic's regional strategy, the foreign and security policy. When these guys say death to Israel, death to America, they actually mean it. But there are some impediments to the Islamic Republic from getting this policy directly off the ground. And some of those impediments, quite literally, in terms of the geography between Iran and Israel, is the heartland of the Middle East, the Arab middle, quite there. In the south, the GCC countries. In the north, the northern tier countries. In the north, the Islamic Republic has basically punctured those states, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and operates what we call a land bridge to transfer men, money, and munitions to terror groups like Lebanese Hezbollah, Hamas, what have you. This is essentially their terror highway, if you will. Them and their militias control even the drugs that flow on some of these highways. We can get to that later. But with the likes of the southern tier, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Iran has long understood that these would be the front lines of any potential conflict against it, sees the tightening military ties historically between the GCC countries and the US, and its proposition or its bargain to these countries has long been a knife and a handshake. The knife is the Houthis, the handshake is the smiling diplomacy. And the goal of the Islamic Republic in the short to medium term towards these countries is, before it tries to contest the state from within by supporting, terror groups and trying to weaken these capitals, what it's trying to do is to force these states to accommodate the Islamic Republic's vision, to absorb the escalation that the Islamic Republic's proxies throw at it, and to continue to remain testing grounds for some of the weapons and ideologies that the Islamic Republic exports. For example, the Houthis in Yemen, which have been fighting for 8+ years against the actual government of that country, are in possession of some of the most diverse, capable precision strike unmanned aerial systems like drones, cruise missiles, and ballistic missiles of any Iranian proxy in the heartland of the Middle East. And this will forever be, deal or no deal, a pressure tool that Tehran has on the cheap against the likes of Riyadh and potentially even the likes of the UAE or some of the other countries that were within striking distance. Some of you may remember that the current then former Prime Minister's plane had to be diverted several times when traveling in this area due to the fact that the arc of some of these weapons could actually hit civilian air traffic. So ultimately, the Islamic Republic's goal with the UAE and Saudi is to force them into a policy of begrudging accommodation. And in private, the Islamic Republic's message is basically, America doesn't have your back. Accommodate me if you want to survive, and get out of my way when I'm trying to do what you know it is that I'm trying to do vis-a-vis the Israelis. And one of the most damaging things in the very short term about the Islamic Republic's warming diplomatic ties with the likes of Saudi Arabia is that it is creating a bumper sticker, which is that Tehran beat Jerusalem to Riyadh. And in this sense, it is trying very, very hard to politically put a death knell in the Abraham Accords, something which I think is needed on steroids in the region.
So what is America supposed to do about this?
Step one has to be do no harm. So it has to be to actually acknowledge what your interest set is and repair the relationships that the Islamic Republic is trying to get you to create lots of unforced errors are. And in this world, if you believe that lesser Chinese involvement in the Persian Gulf is good, then you would want to try to repair relationships with Saudi Arabia and understand where the Chinese are most active, less active, and press on those levers. Ultimately, this is going to be about prioritizing what kind of American policy you want to have in the Middle East. But this Saudi potential drift, footsie with the Islamic Republic did not happen overnight. It happened due to the problems, the politics created around it, and the policies that followed from the politics of about 4 different US presidents and the Saudi relationship and the Saudi impression that no one is going to have their back. So for many years, Tehran and Saudi were 2 kids in a schoolyard where the Saudis would call the principal, the Americans, to try to reprimand the kid they're fighting in the schoolyard, the Islamic Republic. Now the Saudis are calling the parents of the Islamic Republic. They're calling China to come in and try to adjudicate. And this is going to have long-term geostrategic effects for US foreign policy and economic security in the Persian Gulf.
We are at time, but before we go, I'm going to give you 1 minute, Marjan, because there's a very important component to all of this, which is the propaganda war that is going on. ADL did a report along with the Center for Countering Digital Hate around how Iran is promoting its propaganda. If there's a message that you have on this issue with regard to what we ought to be doing and saying to social media companies, what is it?
First of all, I think we should all become more wiser users of social media, not to shy away from it, but to actually use it and support people who are in need of more amplification and more attention, who are telling the truth, who are telling stories about the voices of persecuted people inside Iran that doesn't necessarily get picked up in the mainstream media or in the algorithm. But in terms of the regime's propaganda campaigns, this is not something new. This is something that I lived through, when I lived in Iran, and also that is something I'm witness to as an activist. The power of the propaganda machine of the Islamic Republic is very, very strong. They spend millions of dollars on this, to plan this, to simply delegitimize activists, to trap activists, and to take their lives if they can. They also use their system to, of course, create enmity, unnecessary enmity, and propagate. I mean, why you would ask, why does the Islamic Republic need to have Israel as its enemy or the U.S. as its enemy? They need that because as long as they have somebody else to fight, they have someone to blame for the problems that people are going through. And the enemy is actually what gives them sustenance. So this is why in press TV they say that Jews are responsible for COVID vaccine, for the COVID disease. This is why they say that that the Zionists are conspiring to take Muslim kids away from their religion, or many other lies. So we have to be better users and hold the social media companies accountable, and at least ask them to follow their own terms of service.
Thanks so much, and I would like you to join me in thanking both Ben and Marjan for an excellent conversation. And I would like to also welcome to the stage ADL's Board of Directors member, Nicole Muchnick. Thank you very much.